Hello, this videocast is being recorded specifically for my A-level history group that we covered this topic yesterday, the military collapse of 1918 and the October Reform movement. We didn't quite get to the end of the presentation in the lesson, so this videocast is intended to just complete what we didn't cover in the lesson, and so we'll be focusing on the October Reform. There's a quick overview of what we did cover in the lesson. Ever so briefly, I'll just quickly zoom in each just to remind you of the key sort of points. So we started off by talking about the events in Russia in October 1917, when the Russian provisional government was overthrown by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and how that impacted on Germany, specifically Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who were in effect running the German government, were now given a great opportunity to achieve Siegfrieden, firstly by ending the war in the East, because Lenin was committed to ending the war immediately. This presented Germany with an opportunity to lay down terms in a peace treaty by which they would annex huge swathes of land in the east, so a means of achieving their Siegfrieden objectives, but secondly, a unique opportunity to win the war in the west because they could turn all their armies westwards. The treaty with Russia was called, in March 1918, was called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. As I just said, it implemented the Kreuznach programme. It did actually divide the Reichstag back in Germany, although the majority SPD backed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because they believed that peace at any price was better than was the preferred option. The USPD opposed the treaty on principle, so although it brought the war to an end, they saw it as evidence of capitalist greed, and so were not prepared to support the treaty, so they took that sort of principled view. And the other point about why Brest-Litovsk was important, as highlighted at the end there, is it did hit back on Germany a year later, when Germany did lose the war in the West, and they were presented with the Treaty of Versailles that was very, very punitive. One of the reasons it was so punitive is the Allies had very little sympathy for Germany because of the tough line that Germany had taken against Russia at Brest-Litovsk a year or so earlier. We then focused in on this great opportunity then that Germany had, so she was able to basically now shift her armies that for 4 years had been fighting in the east against Russia. She was able to shift them over to the west, and now at last she can fight a one-front war rather than a war on two fronts, which is what she's had since 1914. The opportunity presented itself when Germany attacked in July 1918. By that point, America was coming into the war. American soldiers had landed in France, and that was one of the difficulties. But at first, it looked as if this great opportunity of having only one front was going to result in a victory for Germany. So Germany launched a massive attack in the west. She broke through the trenches. The British, French and American armies fell into retreat. That was in July 1918. But then on the 8th of August, there was an Allied counterattack and the German troops fell into retreat. And then really the sort of like nail in the coffin for Germany was when on the 29th of September, Germany's ally Bulgaria pulled out of the war. I've referred you to the article by Evans there, The Defeat of 1918, which you can download, and also my notes you can download from the Padlet page as well. So at that point, 29th of September, that was the turning point, and Ludendorff now accepted that German defeat in the West was inevitable. We then looked at the new Chancellor. Because Ludendorff has now accepted impending defeat, he then advised the Kaiser the only way in which we can preserve ourselves, when I say ourselves, Ludendorff was talking about his own social class. He could see an impending revolution happening in Germany unless they did something quickly, the upper classes in Germany. So he advised the Kaiser to introduce political reform in Germany immediately, that the war was ended. He hoped that that would appease the left and the centre opponents in the Reichstag who were against the war, and ensure that the right-wing old order would survive once the war was ended, and that Germany didn't follow the same direction as Russia had gone. That was obviously a hypocritical move by Ludendorff, because Beckmann-Hollweg had given the same advice earlier, and that had resulted in Beckmann-Hollweg's dismissal. So Ludendorff found his own candidate to replace Beckmann-Hollweg. He was one of his own class, a prince, Prince Max von Baden, but he was the ideal appointment to steer the government through reform, because he was a known liberal in his views. So although he was a Prussian elite, he was a liberal, and so was well suited to introduce political reforms in Germany. So a little bit more, we finished off yesterday's lesson by developing this sort of notion of Ludendorff's change of direction. Why did he do this? So Ludendorff basically announced that the war must now end, which is a complete change of direction that he and Hindenburg had since they took over government in 1916. So they introduced and they announced that political reform would be introduced in Germany. Three reasons for that were highlighted. Firstly, introducing political reform would reduce the risk of revolution and ensure that the old order retained some power. Secondly, they actually had no choice. As you know, America had come into the war on the side of the British and French, and the American president, Woodrow Wilson, had laid out in his famous 14 points the terms the Allies would only accept a surrender if Germany accepted certain principles. It was the principles for the future, what Wilson believed, to secure a peaceful Europe in the future. And a key one was that the USA would only accept Germany's surrender on condition that Germany reformed its government and introduced a proper democracy. Thirdly, if Ludendorff passed responsibility to the German Reichstag for accepting surrender, so if he introduces political reform and political reform says the Reichstag after World War I will have much greater power than they had before the war, then the responsibility for negotiating a peace treaty will be passed from the elites who have always traditionally run the country to the Reichstag. So the Reichstag will have to take the responsibility for signing the peace treaty. It was a blatant deflection of responsibility. And it was a very, very cynical move by Ludendorff, because it basically, from Ludendorff's point of view, it meant that when there was popular discontent against Germany's surrender, that when German people grumbled and moaned that Germany had lost the war, Ludendorff could basically deflect blame away from the military leaders and say, well, it was the result of the members of the Reichstag. They were the ones who pushed for the defeat. That Germany's defeat was not because of a military failing, it was because of a failing on the home front. And that is the so-called stab in the back myth. It was important because it fueled popular resentment and bred right-wing anger against the well-meaning left-wing politicians who were saddled with the task of signing the instrument of surrender and ultimately the Treaty of Versailles that was presented to them 8 months later in June 1919. And that sort of popular resentment, that belief, that myth that Germany's defeat was not caused by the military, but it was caused by the politicians at home, was one of the factors that fueled the rise of Nazism during the Weimar Republic. So that's where we reached. Okay, it's just a quick sort of 10-minute overview of what we covered in the lesson. So let's just finish off with the October Reform. Okay, so again, because this is new content, have your mind map in front of you. Obviously, because it's a video, you can pause the video and give yourself more time. So we'll start off with the in a nutshell points. So I'll just sort of zoom in a bit. Now, obviously, these relate to the questions on the right. Okay, so the first question on the right there: why might the October reforms be described as a revolution? The point here is that Prince Max introduced these so-called reforms, these political reforms. He announced that as soon as the war ended, there would be a reform of the way in which the country would be run. That's what the October reforms was. It was an announcement of intention. Okay, so that's what Prince Max announced. The reason that these reforms might be described as a revolution is because basically what they said is that the new Germany, after the end of the war, would become a constitutional monarch. And that's a significant change. A revolution is a significant break with the past, significant break with the way in which things have happened before. Because what the October Reform basically said is that from now on in, the Chancellor and the military would have to give account to the Reichstag, not to the Kaiser. As you know, the old constitution that was set up by Bismarck in 1871 said that the Chancellor, the head of government, was accountable to the Kaiser, not to the Reichstag. The Reichstag being the elected representative body of the German people. So that's a significant change, okay? So the accountability would be downwards, not upwards, okay? The Kaiser would continue, okay? This is what the October Reform proposed, but the Kaiser therefore has lost much of his power, okay? There's no requirement for the head of government, the Chancellor, to give account to the Kaiser. So the Kaiser, as the head of state, would now be much more. His powers would be restricted. Okay, in other words, he would be a monarchy whose powers would be restricted by a new constitution that would give more power to the Reichstag. Okay, a little bit like our Queen in Britain today. Very similar sort of system. Our head of government, our Prime Minister in Britain, has to give account to Parliament, not to the Queen. Okay, so that was basically what the October Reform proposed in October 1918. In addition, another key change was that the Prussian three-tier voting system would be abolished. Now, as we know, that three-tier voting system goes way, way back. It goes back even before 1871. It was a feature of the Prussia that was there before Germany came into existence. And it was clearly a fundamentally unfair system of the empire that was created in 1871 as well, because the three-tier voting system was retained by Bismarck when Germany was created. So the argument is, and this is by historians, okay, there's a debate about this, that if the October Reform had been implemented, and that's another story because we'll get onto that next lesson, it never happened, but the proposal in October was that there would be this significant change. And historians say that was or some historians say that was a significant revolution. Okay, it was a revolution, and you need to be able to engage with that debate, because that's a common question in the exam. Okay, what a very common question is: were the events of 1918 to 1919 a revolution? And you have to be able to debate with that. And a key feature of your answer is to look at the October Reform. Okay. Now, the argument is those historians who believe it was a revolution would argue that it was a revolution from above. Okay, so there's two types of revolution. Okay, one type is a revolution from below, where the change results in popular pressure by ordinary people at the bottom of the social pyramid, the masses, as we often call them. Okay, the millions of ordinary people out on the streets and protesting and pushing for change. If the change results from that pressure, it's a revolution from below. Now, the argument is that this was a revolution from above, because these constitutional changes that were announced from above. They were announced by Chancellor Prince Max, and this was not caused by pressure from below, such as street violence. Okay, now there is debate about that. There are other historians who would say actually street violence did have a play, because the reason that Ludendorff made the decision to appoint Prince Max and to instruct Prince Max to announce political reform from above was because Ludendorff was afraid of the mounting pressure from below. There was pressure from below in Germany in 1918. There were increasing strikes. People were out on the streets protesting against the war. We know that the Reichstag, as the voice of the people, had issued a peace resolution in July 1917. You could argue all of that was pressure from below. So there is a debate about the origins of the October Reform. However, there are also some historians who would argue that the October Revolution was not a revolution. Okay, it was not really a significant change. And that's because the old order, if with this proposal for political reform, including the Kaiser, yes, they would hold less power, because clearly accountability of the Chancellor now is to the Reichstag, it's to below, not to above, but they would still retain some power. And these historians who would argue October Reform was not a revolution would say, look, a proper revolution would get rid of the Kaiser, would get rid of the upper classes. But the October Reform was not suggesting to get rid of them. It was saying, we'll keep the upper classes, we'll keep the Kaiser. The Kaiser will still be the person, the head of state, but their powers will be limited. And that is not a revolution. What that is they would argue that is a gradual change, and you take off the R in revolution, and it is actually an evolutionary change rather than a sudden violent change, a massively significant change. So what we're saying is there are some historians who would argue that the October Reform was a real revolution, and those historians are divided between those who say it was a revolution from above and those who argue it was a revolution from below. But there are also some historians who would say the October Reform was not really sufficient change to call it a revolution. It was more an evolution, a gradual form of change. Okay. The largest party in the Reichstag, the MSPD, led by Hebert, were prepared to accept the October Reform. So you think of our Reichstag, 1914, the SPD were the largest party, 110 members. They did split in 1917 to 18 when a small number of them broke away and formed a separate splinter party, the USPD, but the majority stayed with the original party, and the majority SPD were led by Friedrich Hebert. And as we know, they were on the whole moderate. Although they were left-wing and they wanted reform, they were moderate. They didn't want a revolution. So the MSPD as you know, supported the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because at least it would accelerate an early end to the war, which they thought would benefit the working classes. And now, at this crunch moment, when the October reform was debated in the Reichstag, the MSPD basically accepted it. They said, yeah, good move, great. So the MSPD were prepared to back a reform of the political system rather than abolishing the Kaiser and a more radical reform, which is what the radicals wanted. So the next point, point number 5, which answers the question, how did the radical left wing react to the October reforms and why? So that's question 5 over there. So the radical left wing, the extreme left wing, okay, and they were, remember, the USPD who broke away from the SPD, the Revolutionary Shop Stewards and the Spartacists, okay, they refused to accept the October reform. They saw it as just window dressing. They said, yeah, okay, it looks good, it looks like you're giving power to the ordinary people, but actually you're still keeping the Kaiser. The Kaiser stays there. The upper classes still continue to exist, and they can continue to keep their jobs in the universities and the civil service. So the October reform is just window dressing. It is just camouflage. And so their argument is, no, we're not prepared to accept October reform. If maybe it had been presented a year or 2 years ago, then we might have viewed it differently. But we can see it for what it is. It's a last-ditch attempt to save your skins because you don't want the country going down the path of a full revolution, which is what has happened in Russia. So effectively they're saying too little too late. In their view now, the old order, the upper classes, including the Kaiser, need to be completely removed from power. Germany needs to go in the same direction that Russia has gone. There needs to be a full social revolution, get rid of the upper classes, and introduce a much more radical political change, such as, for example, the introduction of a communist system, as happened in Russia. Okay, so just passing some power down to the Reichstag wasn't enough. Okay, so there you go. That's the October reform in a nutshell. The details. Okay, so the facts that sit beneath it that you need to know are then presented, and these are what are on your notes. Okay, so pick out the details, add to your mind map. But these are sort of like the key facts. Okay, so October 3rd of October 1918, the new Chancellor Max von Baden wrote to the American president asking for an armistice. Okay, notice how Ludendorff on the 26th of October, 3 weeks later, basically then resigned. He's still there, he's still behind the scenes, but he wants to wash his hands of any responsibility. He's like a coward he is, really, I suppose. He's basically given the job to his appointment to do the dirty work, to end the war. So he steps out of the way, he resigns. So Prince Max then sets about doing the dirty task he's been given. So he makes this proposal to reform the constitution, that Germany will become a constitutional monarchy in which the Kaiser's powers are now much reduced. And it was presented to the Reichstag, and the Reichstag voted on it and agreed to pass it on the 28th of October. So the October reform is now effectively law. Okay, and it says from now on in, the Prussian three-class franchise is gone. Okay, and any of the other separate German states, remember they've all got separate parliaments. They likewise, if they have got an unequal and unbalanced voting system, they too have got to change their voting system. So all the separate states have got to have a one-man, one-vote voting system, similar to the national parliament, the Reichstag's voting system that Bismarck had introduced in 1871. Other ones, the army and the navy, are now accountable to the Reichstag. And of course, the Chancellor and his government were also accountable to the Reichstag, which is the point we I covered earlier. So again, a bit more development really, but these are the points we covered in a nutshell. So arguably a revolution from above, because it was a change from above in an orderly fashion. The October reform, there was nothing violent about it. It was an announcement made in the Reichstag. The monarchy would continue, the Kaiser would continue, but considerably less power. Because much more power has been passed to Parliament, to the Reichstag. The leader of the MSPD, Hebert, there he is, and other moderates, so politicians from the Centre Party, the National Liberals, the Progressive Liberals, in other words, the Left Liberals, accepted the October reform. They thought this was a step in the right direction, so the Reichstag basically said, right, we'll end the war, and then there'll be a modified system. The Kaiser will continue, but he'll have much less power, etc. Okay, these moderates believed the changes were substantial and that therefore no need to go beyond them. So it seemed that a revolution from below, such as had happened in Russia, had been held off. Okay, that there wasn't going to be a repetition in Germany of what had happened in Russia in 1917. It seemed that they had held it off, which of course is what Ludendorff and the upper classes wanted. That was their plan. However, and this is what links to the next lesson, Ludendorff and Prince Max and the Kaiser were proved wrong, because there was a substantial number of people on the political left who argued too little too late. The USPD, the Revolution Shop Stewards and the Spartacists, they saw these concessions agreed by the Reichstag as being window dressing, and they took their views out to the streets of Germany then. And we're now moving into November 1918, and said, we're not prepared to accept the October reform. And that's where we'll leave this lesson off. We'll finish off here at this point, and our next lesson, we will pick up the story of what then happened on the streets of Germany. So that's that. So there's our finished picture of what we covered in the lesson. At the back of the handout, there are two sources, Thayer's diary and Hindenburg's memoirs, two of them. Again, just a reminder, we haven't actually done any lessons yet about how to answer source A, but ever since September I have been drip feeding documents to you in lessons, and you should, as part of your ongoing homework, have been reading those documents and highlighting and making the inferences and thinking about the provenance, using your contextual knowledge to try to understand those documents. That's really important. You should have been doing that. So do that with these two sources. Read them, and I've given you some prompts, okay, for those two sources. Why does Hindenburg believe the war could have continued past 1918? So Hindenburg actually disagreed with Ludendorff. He disagreed with ending the war. He actually believed that the war could have been won. Use your own knowledge to challenge Hindenburg's point of view. Try to think, well, why was he wrong? Who does Hindenburg appear to be blaming for Germany's defeat in 1918? And then Thayer's diary entry. In what ways does he disagree with Hindenburg's memoirs? Memoirs are Hindenburg writing after the war in 1920. And finally, a reminder for tomorrow's lesson, have a quick read of the textbook plus my notes. I gave you my notes on the lesson of those points. Okay, we'll be looking at the November 1918 to January 1919. What happened? Defeat, disintegration, and revolution is what we'll cover in our next lesson. That's it. Hopefully that was useful to you, and I will see you in the next lesson. Thank you very much.